Dad already signed the papers, Daniel said, sliding the contract across the polished oak conference table. The house is mine now. Evelyn Harper did not flinch when she heard those words, even though they were about the two-story colonial she had paid off herself over 27 years, the house with the white shutters and the maple tree she planted the spring after her husband passed. The attorney's office smelled faintly of coffee and fresh toner, and the afternoon sun filtered through the blinds in thin gold lines that cut across the legal documents as if underlining the betrayal in black ink. Robert Harper sat at the end of the table, 85 years old, shoulders slightly hunched, but jaw set with the quiet stubbornness Evelyn had known since childhood. And he avoided her eyes as Daniel leaned back in his chair with a confidence that did not belong to him. You gave Dad power of attorney, Daniel added, tapping the page with one finger. He had every right. Evelyn folded her hands neatly in her lap, her wedding ring still resting against her skin though she had been a widow for nearly a decade, and she let the silence stretch long enough for the ticking wall clock to become noticeable. 6 months earlier, a neighbor had mentioned seeing a realtor's sign being measured on her lawn. She had brushed it off as a misunderstanding, trusting that family did not operate in shadows. 3 weeks ago, she received a congratulatory call from a real estate agent about the successful off-market sale, and that was when the unease settled into something colder and sharper. She had built her life carefully, working double shifts as a dental hygienist in her 40s, clipping coupons, refinancing at the right time, paying down a 30-year mortgage in just under 22. She remembered signing the original power of attorney form 10 years ago, after her mother's stroke, believing it was practical to let her father handle certain paperwork while she traveled for work. What she also remembered, and what neither man at the table seemed to realize, was the certified letter she filed 6 years ago when Daniel began borrowing money he never repaid, when small withdrawals from a joint family account appeared without explanation, when she understood that access without limits could become temptation. She had driven to the county clerk's office herself, waited 45 minutes and watched as the clerk stamped the revocation document with a firm metallic thud that echoed in the quiet room. Back in the present, the attorney cleared his throat gently and asked if there were any objections before moving forward with the transfer confirmation, and Daniel's smile widened just slightly, as if the outcome had already been sealed. That was when Evelyn finally lifted her gaze and met her father's eyes, not with anger, not with accusation, but with something steadier. That power of attorney was revoked years ago, she said evenly, her voice calm enough that it did not need to rise to be heard. The words seemed to hang in the air longer than they should have, and for the first time that afternoon, Daniel stopped leaning back and leaned forward instead, confusion replacing confidence. The attorney blinked, adjusted his glasses, and asked her to clarify. Evelyn reached into her structured leather handbag and withdrew a slim folder she had carried in with quiet intention, sliding a notarized copy of the revocation across the table to rest beside the unsigned check for the sale proceeds. The date was clear, the seal unmistakable, the filing number printed at the top in bold black type. Robert's fingers trembled slightly as he stared at the document, and Daniel's mouth opened as if to argue, but no immediate words followed. Outside, a delivery truck rumbled past on Main Street, ordinary life continuing at its usual pace, unaware that inside that small office, the balance of power had shifted without a single raised voice. Evelyn did not smile, did not gloat, did not look triumphant. She simply sat there, shoulders straight, and let the weight of the stamped date speak for itself. The attorney's office remained silent for several long seconds after the stamped date was read aloud, and in that silence Evelyn Harper felt something settle inside her that had been restless for years. She had not come there to argue, and she had not come there to win. She had come prepared. Daniel shifted in his chair, the confidence that had filled the room minutes earlier thinning into uncertainty, while Robert continued staring at the revocation document as though the ink might rearrange itself if he looked long enough. The attorney cleared his throat again and explained in careful, measured language that if the power of attorney had indeed been legally revoked and recorded with the county 6 years prior, then any transaction executed under its authority would be invalid. The words were clinical, professional, stripped of emotion, yet they carried the weight of consequence. Daniel protested that his father had signed everything in good faith, that the buyer had already wired earnest money, that this was only a technical oversight, but the attorney gently reminded him that property law did not bend for assumptions. Evelyn listened without interrupting. She remembered the afternoon she filed the revocation as clearly as she remembered the day she received the keys to her house. It had been early spring, still chilly, with a thin layer of frost clinging to the grass outside the county building. She had taken a half-day off work, worn her navy wool coat, and carried a folder with every bank statement that had unsettled her over the previous year. Daniel had called repeatedly asking for short-term loans, promising repayment within weeks that turned into months, and Robert had defended him each time with the same soft excuse that family helped family. What concerned Evelyn was not generosity but access. She had noticed unfamiliar inquiries about her mortgage balance and a request for property valuation that she had not authorized. That was when she understood that trust without boundaries could quietly become exposure. The clerk at the county office had asked if she was certain she wished to revoke the document, explaining that many families relied on such arrangements as parents aged. Evelyn had answered calmly that clarity prevented conflict, and she signed the revocation with steady hands. Back in the present, the attorney requested the original filing number and made a brief call to confirm it was recorded in the public record. As he waited for verification, Daniel leaned toward Evelyn and lowered his voice, asking why she would do something so extreme without telling them. She met his gaze evenly and replied that protection was not extreme, it was responsible. Robert finally spoke, his voice thinner than she remembered from her childhood, and said he believed he was helping balance things between his children. Evelyn did not challenge him. She understood that in his mind fairness meant redistribution, that he had watched Daniel struggle with business ventures that never quite stabilized, and he had mistaken Evelyn's stability for surplus. The attorney ended his call and confirmed the revocation was valid and properly filed, and that any sale contract based on the expired authority would need to be halted immediately. The room shifted again, this time not with shock but with realization. Daniel sat back slowly, as though recalculating something invisible, and Robert closed his eyes for a brief moment. Evelyn gathered her folder without hurry. She did not accuse them of betrayal, did not list the sacrifices she had made, did not recount the overtime hours and careful budgeting that had built her equity. She simply stated that no decision regarding her home would move forward without her signature, and that from this point on all financial communication would come directly to her. Outside the office window, traffic lights changed from red to green in steady rhythm, indifferent to family misunderstandings and legal corrections. Evelyn rose from her chair with the same composure she had carried in, aware that the situation was far from over, but equally aware that preparation had given her something stronger than anger. It had given her leverage, and leverage did not require raised voices to be felt. The hallway outside the attorney's office felt cooler than the conference room, and for a moment Evelyn Harper stood still beneath the fluorescent lights, listening to the low murmur of voices behind the closed door. Daniel's tone had lost its earlier edge and now carried a hurried sharpness, as if he believed volume could repair what paperwork had undone. Robert's voice, softer and slower, drifted in between, attempting to steady the conversation with familiar phrases about family and understanding. Evelyn did not wait to hear more. She walked toward the elevator, the steady click of her heels against the tile echoing in measured rhythm, the same rhythm she had kept through decades of building her life without shortcuts. When the elevator doors opened, she stepped inside alone and pressed the button for the ground floor, watching her reflection in the brushed metal panel. There was no anger in her expression, only clarity. She knew this moment was not about a house alone. It was about a pattern that had stretched quietly across years, about assumptions made on her behalf without her consent. As the elevator descended, she remembered the first time Daniel hinted that her home was larger than she needed. It had been at Thanksgiving, 3 years after her husband's passing, when the dining table still felt too long for one person. Daniel had commented that a 4-bedroom house was a heavy responsibility for someone living alone, suggesting that downsizing would free up resources for other opportunities. At the time, Evelyn had nodded politely, believing the suggestion was practical. Later she learned that Daniel had been researching comparable sales in her neighborhood. She did not confront him then. Instead, she scheduled a meeting with her financial advisor and quietly updated her estate plan. She created a trust that placed the house solely under her management, ensuring that no external signature could alter its status without direct authorization. She also instructed the county assessor to flag her property file so that any transfer request would trigger immediate notification to her home address. These were not dramatic actions. They were deliberate ones. When the elevator reached the lobby, Evelyn stepped out into the late afternoon sunlight. The air carried the faint scent of freshly cut grass from the courthouse lawn across the street, and traffic moved steadily along Main Street as though nothing significant had occurred. She crossed to her sedan, unlocked the door, and sat behind the wheel without starting the engine. For a moment she allowed herself to breathe in the quiet. Her phone buzzed on the passenger seat. A text from Daniel appeared, asking why she had blindsided them and warning that the buyer might pursue legal action for breach of contract. Evelyn read the message once and set the phone face down. She had already spoken to the attorney about potential consequences, and she knew that liability would fall on the party who initiated an unauthorized transaction. Preparation had covered more ground than Daniel realized. She started the engine and drove the familiar 3 miles home, passing the grocery store where she had clipped coupons in her 40s, the hardware store where she had purchased paint during the first renovation, the small park where she had once watched her daughter ride a bicycle. Each landmark reminded her that the house was not an abstract asset. It was the result of intention, sacrifice, and years measured in monthly payments. When she turned onto her street, the maple tree in her front yard stood steady in the early evening light, its leaves moving gently in the breeze. She parked in the driveway and remained seated for a few seconds longer, aware that the confrontation at the office had only opened the conversation rather than closed it. Inside, the kitchen clock ticked steadily above the refrigerator, the same sound that had marked ordinary mornings for nearly 3 decades. Evelyn placed her folder on the counter and poured herself a glass of water. She understood that Daniel would not retreat easily and that Robert's disappointment would surface in quieter ways. Yet, she also understood something more important. She had drawn a line that could not be erased by assumption or persuasion. And this time, it was recorded in ink. That evening the house felt larger than usual, not because anything had changed in its square footage, but because clarity has a way of widening space. Evelyn Harper moved slowly through the kitchen, rinsing her glass and placing it upside down on the drying rack, her movements measured and unhurried. Outside, the sun dipped behind the neighboring rooftops, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors she had refinished herself 12 years ago. She paused near the dining room doorway and let her eyes rest on the table that had once seated 6 comfortably, then 4, and now most nights only 1. The silence did not intimidate her. It reminded her of the years when she and her late husband, Thomas, had sat there reviewing bills with a calculator and a yellow legal pad, deciding which expenses could wait and which could not. They had agreed early in their marriage that the house would be their anchor, something solid in a world that shifted easily. When Thomas passed after a brief illness, the mortgage balance still showed 6 figures, and more than one person suggested she sell and simplify her life. She chose instead to stay and accelerate payments, taking on additional hours at the clinic and cutting discretionary spending down to the essentials. She remembered packing her own lunch every day for nearly 3 years, brewing coffee at home instead of stopping at the corner shop, and channeling every bonus check directly toward principal. Those sacrifices had not been dramatic. They had been steady. The memory of those years returned now not as nostalgia, but as confirmation. This house represented discipline, not surplus. Later that evening her phone rang. Robert's name appeared on the screen. Evelyn let it ring twice before answering, giving herself a moment to steady the tone of her voice. Her father began by, saying he had not intended to cause distress and that he believed he was preventing future complications by transferring the property while he was still able to make decisions. He spoke about wanting to see Daniel secure before he passed, about not wanting conflict after he was gone. Evelyn listened without interrupting, standing near the living room window where the streetlight flickered on as dusk settled. When he finished, she responded calmly that security built on invalid authority could not last, and that planning without transparency created the very conflict he wished to avoid. There was a long pause on the line. Robert admitted he had not realized the revocation had been filed. He had assumed the document remained active because no one had challenged it. Evelyn did not point out that assumption was the root of the problem. Instead, she said that from now on, any conversation involving her assets would include her directly, in writing, and with professional oversight. After the call ended, she sat in the armchair beside the fireplace and opened the folder again, reviewing each document with deliberate care. She noted the dates, the seals, the confirmations. Preparation had not been impulsive. It had been gradual, born from patterns she had observed quietly over time. She thought back to the afternoon she updated her trust with her estate planner, specifying that no beneficiary could access or leverage the property during her lifetime. She had not shared that detail with Daniel or Robert, not out of secrecy, but out of prudence. Trust, she had learned, was healthiest when paired with structure. The house creaked softly as temperatures cooled outside, a familiar sound she had once associated with loneliness, but now recognized as stability. Evelyn closed the folder and placed it in the safe inside her bedroom closet, spinning the dial carefully until it clicked into place. She understood that the events at the attorney's office were only the beginning of a larger recalibration within her family. Daniel would likely attempt persuasion, perhaps even appeal to emotion, framing the matter as a misunderstanding rather than a boundary. Robert would struggle between pride and regret. Yet as she turned off the lights and prepared for bed, Evelyn felt no urge to revisit the decision. The line had been drawn long before that afternoon. It had simply become visible. The next morning, Evelyn Harper woke before sunrise, not because of anxiety, but because her mind had already begun arranging the next steps with quiet precision. The house was still, the early light barely visible through the curtains, and she lay for a moment listening to the familiar hum of the refrigerator down the hall. Routine had always been her anchor. She rose, made her bed neatly, and moved to the kitchen to prepare coffee, measuring the grounds carefully the way she had done for years. While the coffee brewed, her phone vibrated against the counter. 3 missed calls from Daniel had arrived overnight, along with 2 messages that shifted in tone from frustration to persuasion. In the first, he insisted that the failed sale would damage his credibility with investors. In the second, he wrote that the family could have handled this privately without attorneys if she had simply trusted them. Evelyn read each message slowly, then placed the phone face down again. Trust, she thought, was never a substitute for documentation. After breakfast, she sat at the dining table with her laptop and opened a secure email from her financial advisor confirming that he had been notified of the attempted transfer. She typed a measured response requesting a full review of her property records, insurance coverage, and beneficiary designations. She also scheduled an appointment to discuss adding an additional layer of oversight, ensuring that any future inquiry about her assets would require direct verbal confirmation from her before proceeding. These were not reactions fueled by anger. They were adjustments made in response to evidence. Around mid-morning, Daniel appeared unannounced at her front door. Evelyn saw his sedan pull into the driveway through the front window, and she took a slow breath before opening the door. He stepped inside without waiting for invitation, glancing around the living room as if seeing it differently now, as if its value had shifted from sentimental to strategic. He began speaking immediately, explaining that he had already planned renovations and that the buyer had been prepared to close within 30 days. Evelyn listened from her armchair, hands folded calmly. When he paused, she asked one question. Had he ever intended to ask her before signing? Daniel hesitated, then admitted that he believed she would resist, and that he and Robert had agreed it was easier to act first. The admission settled between them, heavy but clear. Evelyn replied that ease was not the same as integrity, and that decisions made to avoid discomfort often created larger consequences. Daniel's voice softened as he shifted tactics, suggesting that she could still sell voluntarily and divide the proceeds in a way that supported everyone. He reminded her of past financial help she had given him and framed the house as an underused resource. Evelyn stood and walked to the window, looking out at the maple tree swaying lightly in the breeze. She explained that generosity given freely was not a precedent for access taken without consent. She told him that the house was not a pool of shared equity, but a personal investment maintained with discipline. Daniel's shoulders dropped slightly, and for the first time he appeared less confident and more uncertain. He asked whether she intended to shut him out completely. Evelyn turned back toward him and answered that boundaries were not exclusion, they were clarity. She would not sever family ties, but she would not compromise legal ones either. Daniel left shortly after, the tension in his posture replaced by something closer to reflection. When the door closed behind him, the house felt steady again. Evelyn returned to the table and opened a new document on her laptop, drafting a written notice that all financial discussions involving her property must occur with her present and documented. She printed 2 copies, signed both, and placed one in her records while preparing to mail the other to Robert. The action was simple, almost administrative, yet it marked another step in reinforcing the structure she had quietly built. Outside, the afternoon sun climbed higher, illuminating the white shutters and casting sharp shadows along the driveway. Evelyn stood at the kitchen sink and watched the light shift across the yard. She understood that resistance might continue, that persuasion might reappear in different forms, but she also understood that consistency outlasted pressure. She had not raised her voice, had not retaliated, had not attempted to humiliate. She had simply insisted on recognition of what was already legally hers. And in that insistence, something fundamental had changed. The assumption that she could be moved without her knowledge had been replaced with the certainty that she could not. 2 days after Daniel's visit, Evelyn Harper drove to her financial advisor's office with the same steady composure she had carried into the attorney's conference room earlier that week. The building stood just off the highway, a modest brick structure with tinted windows and neatly trimmed hedges, the kind of place designed to look stable rather than impressive. She arrived 10 minutes early, as she always did, and sat in the waiting area reviewing the printed notices she had drafted the night before. Each page was clean, direct, and free of accusation. They simply clarified that no inquiry, valuation request, or proposed transaction involving her property would be entertained without her explicit, documented consent. When her advisor, Michael Reynolds, invited her into his office, he listened carefully as she described the attempted sale and the invalid authority behind it. He did not interrupt. He did not dramatize. He asked measured questions about timeline and documentation, and she answered each one with dates and filing numbers. By the end of the meeting, they had agreed to implement additional safeguards, including account alerts for any third-party contact and a formal letter to be sent to the title company involved in the halted transaction. Evelyn signed the necessary forms with steady hands. Preparation, she knew, was most effective when layered. Later that afternoon, Robert called again. His voice sounded tired, less defensive than before. He admitted that Daniel had reacted strongly after leaving her house, frustrated that what he had assumed was secured had dissolved in a single afternoon. Robert asked whether there was any path forward that did not involve public correction or legal embarrassment. Evelyn answered calmly that correction was not humiliation and that transparency prevented escalation. She suggested that they meet together with the attorney once more, not to argue but to establish written clarity about boundaries. Robert hesitated, then agreed. The meeting was scheduled for the following week. In the days leading up to it, Evelyn maintained her routine. She walked 1 mile each morning through her neighborhood, greeting familiar faces and noticing how little the outside world shifted despite internal family tension. She paid her utility bills, trimmed the rose bushes near the porch, and sorted through old paperwork in her study, discarding documents no longer necessary. The act of organizing steadied her thoughts. She found an old folder containing the final mortgage statement from the year she paid off the house entirely. She remembered the satisfaction of that moment, the realization that the structure around her belonged solely to her effort. That memory strengthened her resolve. When the day of the second meeting arrived, she entered the attorney's office with the same calm posture as before. Daniel was already seated, his expression restrained but tight around the edges. Robert looked smaller than she remembered, his shoulders slightly curved inward. The attorney reviewed the prior events and confirmed that the attempted sale had been officially voided. He also noted that the buyer had withdrawn interest once informed of the title complication. Daniel exhaled slowly at that information, some of his tension easing. Evelyn then presented the written notice she had drafted, explaining that it was not a punishment but a framework. She outlined that any future estate planning discussions would occur in her presence, with separate representation if necessary, and that no document referencing her property would proceed without dual verification. Daniel began to argue that such measures implied distrust. Evelyn responded that structure existed precisely because trust could fluctuate. The room quieted as the attorney reviewed her proposal and acknowledged its reasonableness. Robert finally spoke, admitting that he had underestimated the seriousness of bypassing her consent. He apologized, not dramatically, but with visible sincerity. Evelyn accepted the apology without embellishment. She did not soften the boundary she had drawn, but she allowed space for correction. By the time the meeting concluded, the atmosphere had shifted from confrontation to recalibration. Outside, the sky was clear, the late afternoon sun reflecting off windshields in the parking lot. Evelyn paused beside her car, noticing that her pulse remained steady. She had not needed to raise her voice or repeat herself. Documentation had done the work that emotion could not. As she drove home, she considered how easily assumptions can evolve into entitlement when left unchallenged. Yet, she also recognized that challenge did not require aggression. It required preparation, patience, and the willingness to remain composed while others recalculated. When she turned into her driveway, the maple tree stood unchanged, its leaves casting patterned shadows across the lawn. The house remained exactly where it had always been, solid and quiet. Evelyn parked, stepped out, and walked toward the front door with measured steps. The boundary had not fractured the family. It had clarified it. And clarity, she understood, was stronger than permission ever had been. In the weeks that followed the second meeting, the atmosphere between Evelyn Harper and her family settled into something quieter, but not entirely resolved. There were fewer calls from Daniel, and when he did reach out, his tone carried restraint rather than urgency. Robert, meanwhile, began asking practical questions instead of making assumptions, requesting copies of documents before referencing them in conversation. The shift was subtle, yet Evelyn recognized it immediately. Structure had replaced improvisation. One Saturday afternoon, Daniel arrived again, this time calling ahead and waiting in the driveway until she opened the front door. He stepped inside with a folder in his hands, not the confident stride he once displayed, but a measured pace that suggested reconsideration. He explained that he had reviewed his own finances and realized how heavily he had relied on anticipated outcomes rather than confirmed ones. He admitted that he had assumed access because past support had been consistent. Evelyn listened without interruption, standing near the kitchen counter where sunlight reflected softly off the granite surface. She told him that reliance built on assumption is fragile, and that independence required planning grounded in reality rather than expectation. Daniel nodded slowly. He said he had begun speaking with a financial counselor about restructuring his business obligations and reducing debt. It was not an apology in the dramatic sense, but it was acknowledgement. Evelyn poured 2 glasses of water and handed one to him, her movements unhurried. She explained that boundaries were not designed to punish, but to protect relationships from erosion. When expectations remain unspoken, resentment grows quietly. Daniel admitted he had never considered how his perspective might have appeared from her side. To him, the house was an asset with potential leverage. To her, it was stability earned through discipline. The difference had never been discussed directly. Later that evening, Robert called to confirm he had received the written notice she mailed earlier in the week. His voice sounded steadier than before. He acknowledged that clarity would prevent future confusion and expressed gratitude that the matter had not escalated beyond correction. Evelyn responded simply that documentation preserves peace better than persuasion. The following month, she invited both men to dinner, not as a reconciliation ceremony, but as a continuation of ordinary life. She prepared roasted chicken, steamed vegetables, and fresh bread, setting the table with the same care she always had. When Daniel arrived, he complimented the maple tree in the yard, noting how tall it had grown. Robert remarked that the house felt unchanged, solid as ever. Throughout the meal, conversation remained practical, focused on daily matters rather than past tension. There were moments of silence, but they were not heavy. They were reflective. After dinner, as they cleared the plates, Daniel asked whether she would ever consider selling voluntarily in the distant future. Evelyn answered calmly that any decision about her property would come from her own timeline, not from pressure or assumption. She added that planning for the future required conversation, not maneuvering. Daniel agreed. When they left that night, the air outside carried the cool hint of approaching autumn. Evelyn stood at the doorway watching their car disappear down the street, aware that trust does not reset instantly. It rebuilds through repetition and evidence. Inside, she locked the door and turned off the porch light, moving through the house with the quiet assurance of someone who has defended what she built without losing herself in the process. The house creaked softly as it always did when temperatures shifted, and the sound felt less like loneliness and more like confirmation. The attempted transfer had not dismantled her stability. It had revealed it. By insisting on documentation rather than debate, she had shifted the balance not through confrontation, but through preparedness. And in doing so, she had reminded everyone, including herself, that calm clarity carries more weight than assumption ever could.